The air on the outer cape went soft and wrong in the first week of March. The surf hit the bar with a low percussion you could feel through the floor of any building close enough to hear it. Gulls stopped flying. The harbor smelled of iron. Behind the dunes, a woman stood in the doorway of a cabin whose north wall showed daylight through the gaps. She held a boy against her chest. He breathed with a sound like paper tearing slowly. On the shelf above the stove, a cracked teacup held everything she had left. Peter Halverson drowned in November of 1887, 4 months before the storm that would test everything his widow had left. He went into the surf near Pamet Harbor to haul a dory that had slipped its mooring, and the sea took him in the time it takes to draw 2 breaths. They found the dory. They did not find Peter for 9 days. Bere Brecke Halvorsen was 33 years old. She had 2 children. Eli was 8, old enough to understand what the black ribbon on the door meant, and young enough to believe her mother could fix anything. Thomas was 5, and his chest had not been right since winter fever took hold in January. He coughed in the mornings. He coughed at night. In between, he breathed with a sound like paper tearing slowly. They lived in a cabin behind the dunes on the outer cape, near Truro, Massachusetts. Peter had built it the way a fisherman builds, with what he could drag from the shore and buy on credit from the yard. The frame was up, the roof held, but the north wall had never been properly sealed. The chinking, a mix of mud, oakum, and crushed shell, had shrunk through the autumn and fallen in chunks the size of a child's fist. Beret could see daylight through the gaps when the sun hit right. On calm days, the gaps did not matter much. On windy days, the stove lost its draft every time the front door opened, and smoke crawled sideways across the ceiling like something trying to escape. She had 1¼ cords of scrub pine stacked against the south wall, a sack of cornmeal, 7 potatoes, 2 oil lamps with enough whale oil for perhaps 10 days of careful use, and $31 hidden in a cracked teacup on the shelf above the stove, which was every cent Peter had not owed to someone else. The cabin lot carried a note. The note belonged to Hiram Pike. Beret could not leave. Passage to Boston for herself and 2 children cost more than $31. Her only family lived across the Atlantic in a parish outside Bergen she had not seen in 11 years. If she abandoned the cabin, she lost the lot, the single asset Peter had left behind, and Hiram Pike would take it for the debt. She would arrive in Boston with 2 children, no trade, no English good enough for shop work, and a 5-year-old who could not breathe in cold air. She stayed because there was no direction to walk that did not end worse. The first week of March brought a smell off the water that the old men at the harbor recognized. The air went soft and wrong. Barometric pressure dropped at the life-saving station, and the surfman on watch noted it in his log without commentary. Telegraph chatter from New York and Boston mentioned a low-pressure system organizing itself somewhere in the Atlantic with the slow, deliberate patience of something that intended to stay. Beret did not read telegraphs. She read the stove. On the morning of March 8th, she fed it a 1/4 log of pine, opened the damper, and watched the smoke curl sideways instead of up. The wind was northeast, steady, and it came through the north wall as if the chinking were not there. She braced the stove door with her boot and held Thomas against her chest. His breathing sounded worse when the air moved. That afternoon, she walked to the life-saving station and asked Captain Alden Cobb whether she could patch her north wall with canvas. Cobb was 60 years old. He had pulled men from the surf for 3 decades. He had hands like dock rope and opinions he delivered the way he delivered rescue lines, with accuracy and without apology. He agreed to look at the cabin because Beret asked directly and did not cry, and because Peter had once helped the station crew drag a spar off the beach without being asked. Cobb walked the cabin in 4 minutes. He pressed his mittened hand against each seam on the north wall, then the east. He crouched at the sill where sand had drifted through. He looked at the stovepipe joint where smoke leaked from a crack in the elbow. He studied the front door, which faced northeast, directly into the prevailing storm wind, with no porch, no entry, no barrier of any kind between the latch and the Atlantic. He did not sit down. He stood in the center of the single room with his arms crossed and spoke to Beret the way he spoke to green surfmen who had not yet understood the ocean. You need 3 men, 2 dry days, 6 barrels of clay, and 4 more cords stacked before dark, Cobb said. You have none of those. Beret said nothing. She waited. Cobb explained the conventional method: re-chink with mud, horsehair, and lime scrap. Drive oak wedges into the worst gaps. Hang storm boards on the windward side. Bank snow against the sill once the storm started to create a dead air barrier at the base. Build a small porch if possible. Even a lean-to of planks and canvas would break the direct wind path to the door. Each solution required something Beret did not have. Mud was frozen in the ground. Horsehair came from a stable she could not afford. Lime scrap cost money at the yard. Oak wedges required oak, a saw, and time. Storm boards required boards. The porch required lumber, nails, and at least one other pair of hands. The storm coming is not ordinary rain, Cobb said. He had heard the telegraph talk. A coastal low, deepening. The station was preparing extra line and blankets. If it pins you inside for 2 days, maybe 3, that stove will eat a quarter cord a night trying to fight what comes through these walls. You have 5 days of wood if you're careful, and this storm may not care about careful. Beret asked what would happen to Thomas if the stove went out. Cobb looked at the boy. Thomas sat on the cot with his knees drawn up, breathing through his mouth. The sound filled the cabin. Water freezes in the kettle by morning, Cobb said. You know that. He told her to come to the station if conditions turned. He said it without enthusiasm because the station was already expecting casualties from the harbor and the beach road, and a woman with 2 children and a sick boy would be one more problem in a building designed for 8 men and their gear. Cobb left. He did not close the door tightly because the latch was warped, and the wind came in behind him and scattered ash from the stove across Eli's feet. That night, Beret did the math again. She burned a quarter cord per week when the wind blew through the gaps. If the storm lasted 3 days and the wind held northeast, she would burn faster, half a cord, maybe more, just to keep the cabin above freezing. She had 1 1/4 cords. 3 days of storm would leave her with 3/4 of a cord and the rest of March still ahead. Tomas could not breathe cold air. If the flame died, the cabin would reach freezing within hours. If Tomas's chest seized in freezing air, she would have to carry him through the storm to the station, 1.5 miles along the beach road in conditions Cobb himself called dangerous. The math did not work. It did not work with wood. It did not work with canvas. It did not work with anything Cobb had described. She sat on the floor beside the stove with her back against the warm iron and listened to the wind testing every seam in the north wall. Eli was asleep. Thomas coughed twice, then settled. The stove ticked as it cooled between feeds. Beret did not sleep. She thought about the door. Every time it opened, the stove died. Not fully, the coals held, but the draft reversed. Smoke filled the room, and the heat she had spent a log building bled out in seconds. The north wall was bad. The pipe joint was bad. But the door was the wound that would not close. It faced the storm. It had no shield. And it opened a dozen times a day, for water, for the privy, for wood, for anything that required stepping outside. She could seal every gap in the north wall and still lose the cabin through that door. By morning, she had not solved anything, but she had named the problem. The enemy was not cold. The enemy was wind through an unprotected opening, stealing heat faster than pine could replace it. She needed something between the storm and that door, something the wind could not simply push through. On the 9th of March, Beret walked to the beach at low tide. She told herself she was going for driftwood, any scrap of dry timber she could drag back and stack. Eli came with her. Thomas stayed in the cabin with the stove door shut and a blanket over his chest. The beach was littered with wrack. The last high tide had thrown up long windrows of debris, broken lath, tangled rope, cork floats, crab shells, and everywhere a duan, in silver-gray ribbons stretching for hundreds of yards along the tide line, dead eelgrass. It lay in mats and tangles, some of it mixed with dark kelp, some of it clean and pale and dry beneath the wet outer layer. Eli wrinkled her nose. "It smells like fish and dirt." It did. The wet layer smelled of brine and decay. But Beret crouched and pulled a handful from beneath the surface crust, and the grass underneath was different. Pale, dry, ribboned like flax that had been combed but never spun. It smelled of salt, not rot. She squeezed it, and it sprang back in her hand. The sight cracked something open in her memory. She was 9 years old, standing in a low shed that smelled of salt, smoke, and old rope. Ragna Kvami knelt on a plank floor, twisting dried eelgrass into tight rolls and pressing them between boards, with a motion that looked like kneading bread. Ragna was a widow then, too, a woman from Lesse who had crossed to Norway and then to America with the knowledge of an island in her hands. Ragna had pressed Beret's palm flat against the shed wall, a wall packed with something that felt like coarse hair. "Feel," Ragna said, "cold on your side, warm on mine. The trick is not heat. The trick is stopping moving air." Beret had been too young to understand the principle. She understood the feeling. The wall was cool on the outside, but when Ragna opened the inspection hatch, the inside of the packed cavity was dry and still and warmer than the air in the shed itself. "The grass holds pockets," Ragna said. "Air that does not move does not steal." That was 24 years ago. Ragna had shown her how to sort the grass. Pale ribbon from black weed, dry from damp, springy from flat. She had shown her how to shake the sand out, how to test for rot by smell, how to pack it loose enough that the air stayed trapped but tight enough that wind could not cut through. Beret had filed it away the way children file away adult knowledge, wakwao, without understanding its value, without imagining a moment when it would matter more than anything else she knew. She stood on the beach near Truro with a handful of dry eelgrass in her fist and looked at the windrows stretching in both directions. There was more material here than she could carry in a week. The sea had thrown it up and left it. She took the handful home. In the cabin, she held a clump of eelgrass over the stove flame with the iron tongs. The grass charred at the edges. It curled and blackened, but it did not flash. It did not leap into flame the way hay would, the way dry pine shavings did. It smoldered and shrank and went out when she pulled it from the heat. She held dry beach grass to the same flame, and it flared in her hand, bright and instant. Eli watched from the cot. "What are you doing?" "Thinking," Beret said. She looked at the front door. She looked at the stove. She thought about Cobb's list. 3 men, 2 dry days, 6 barrels of clay, 4 cords of wood. And she thought about what she actually had. She had beach grass that did not burn fast. She had scrap lumber from Pater's unfinished fish rack. She had bent nails and rope. She had sailcloth from the dory they had recovered after Pater drowned. She had 1 day, maybe 2, before the storm. The idea took shape not as inspiration, but as arithmetic. If she could not stop the wind at the wall, she could stop it at the door. Not with a porch. She had no lumber for a proper porch, but with a passage, a corridor, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6.5 feet high, double planked, with the cavity between the planks packed with eelgrass, a foot thick on both walls, more on the roof. The outer end would face away from the northeast wind. The inner end would connect to the cabin door. The corridor would not heat anything. It would not replace the wood she did not have. What it would do was break the wind path. Every time she opened the cabin door, she would step into a still passage instead of a gale. The stove would keep its draft. The heat would stay inside. The eelgrass in the walls would stop conduction the way Ragnar's shed walls had stopped it, by trapping air in thousands of small pockets that did not move. One thick barrier of dead grass between her children and the Atlantic. It sounded insane. She knew it sounded insane. A woman alone, building a seaweed hallway onto a half-finished cabin in the 2 days before a nor'easter. Cobb would say she had lost her mind. Prudence would shake her head. Hiram Pike would laugh until his eyes watered. But the math worked differently than the mockery. 4 cords of wood cost money she did not have and time that did not exist. Eelgrass cost nothing. It lay on the beach in tonnage. The labor was hers, and she had 2 hands and a reason not to stop. She told Eli to watch Tomas. She took the canvas sack and walked back to the beach. Prudence Nickerson saw Beret hauling the second load before noon. Prudence was 42, married to a fisherman who was somewhere between Provincetown and Gloucester, and she had raised 4 children in a house that leaked less than Beret's because her husband had been alive long enough to finish the walls. She was not cruel. She was practical in the way that coastal women were practical. She measured charity by what it cost and kindness by what it risked. She crossed the sand path between their lots and watched Beret dump a sack of eelgrass beside the cabin door. "What is that for?" "The walls," Beret said. Prudence looked at the pile. It was gray-green, tangled, flecked with sand and shell. It looked like what the tide left behind because that is exactly what it was. "You mean to keep children warm with beach rot?" Beret did not argue. She reached into the pile and split it. The black, wet kelp, rubbery and stinking, she threw to the left. The pale, dry eelgrass, ribboned and light, she kept. She shook sand from a handful. She held it to her nose. "Salt," she said. "Not rot." Prudence did not look convinced. "Mice will come." "Mice want grain and dry straw. This is salt ribbon. They will not nest in it." "It will hold damp." "The inside is dry. Feel." Prudence put her hand into the clump. She did not say anything for a moment. The grass was dry inside, cooler than the air but not wet. "It will burn," Prudence said. "One spark from that stove and you will have a fire you cannot stop." Beret held a lit match to a strand of eelgrass. It charred slowly, curling at the tip, and went dark. She held a match to dry beach grass. It caught instantly, a flare of yellow that Prudence stepped back from. "It does not burn like hay," Beret said. "It shrinks." Prudence watched the demonstration. She was not converted, but she could not explain what she had just seen, and that silence was enough for Beret. She went back to sorting. The objections Prudence raised were real: smell, damp, vermin, fire, shame. Each one had an answer Beret had tested or could test. The objection she could not answer was simpler and worse. Nobody did this. No house on the Cape had seaweed walls. No builder recommended it. No man Prudence respected had endorsed it. And in a community where survival depended on shared knowledge and proven methods, doing something nobody recognized was as dangerous as doing nothing at all. Beret understood the risk. If the corridor failed, if it collapsed, soaked through, caught fire, or simply did not stop the wind, she would have wasted the last building day before the storm. She would have spent nails, rope, and sailcloth on a structure that proved Hiram Pike right, and the town would say what towns always said about women who ignored advice. She brought it on herself. She sorted eelgrass until her fingers cracked from the salt. The news reached Nye's store by afternoon. A woman up by the dunes was building some kind of seaweed shed onto her door, and she was doing it alone with her dead husband's fish rack lumber. Hiram Pike heard it while checking his ledger. He was 48, thick through the chest, deliberate in his movements. He sold cordwood, lamp oil, and nails at prices that rose when the weather did. He held notes on 6 properties along the outer cape, and Peter Halverson's cabin lot was one of them. If Beret defaulted, the lot reverted to him. He had already spoken to a man from Wellfleet about selling it. Hiram set down his pen. "She is building a privy for the ocean," he said, and the men by the stove laughed because Hiram expected them to. The mockery traveled. By evening, 3 separate people had described Beret's project to someone else, and each description was less accurate than the last. She was stuffing her cabin with kelp. She was trying to grow a garden on her roof. She was so addled by grief that she thought the sea could keep her warm. Hiram drove his wagon out to the cabin at dusk. He stood at the edge of the lot and looked at the pile of sorted eelgrass, the salvaged posts from the fish rack, the dory sailcloth weighted with stones. "Beret?" he said. His tone was the tone of a man who has already decided the outcome and is performing concern. "I heard about this. I came to offer you something better." She stood with a post-hole bar in her hands. Her dress was salt-stained at the knees. Her hair was loose from the wind. "2 cords," Hiram said. "Dry oak. Delivered tonight. On your account." Beret knew what the account meant. The rate Hiram charged for storm price wood on credit would add enough to Pater's existing note that she would lose the cabin by April. He was not offering fuel. He was offering a transaction that ended with him holding the lot and Beret holding nothing. "And if the children need shelter before the storm passes," Hiram added, "I have the inland shed, warm and dry. We can work out terms." The inland shed was a storage building Hiram rented to seasonal workers at 3 times what it was worth. The terms would be Beret's labor, washing, mending, cooking, for as long as Hiram decided the debt required. "No," Beret said. Hiram looked at the eelgrass. He looked at the half-framed corridor posts. He looked at the cabin with its gapped north wall and its crooked stove pipe. "By morning," he said, "that stinking ocean hallway will be frozen harder than a coffin lid, and your boy's chest will not forgive you for pride." He climbed back onto the wagon. He did not offer again. Beret stood in the dark with the post-hole bar and listened to the wagon wheels creak over frozen sand. Her hands shook, not from cold, from the effort of refusing the only help anyone had offered because the help was a trap dressed in firewood. She went inside. She fed the stove. She checked Tomas, who was asleep with his mouth open, breathing in shallow pulls. She sat on the floor and counted her money. $31. Nails cost money. She would need nails, more than she had in Pater's scrap box. In the morning, she walked to Nye's store. She did not ask for new nails. She asked for bent nails from the scrap tin, the ones the yardmen tossed when they pulled old lumber apart. Nobody bought bent nails. They were junk. The storekeeper looked at her. The men by the stove looked at her. She stood at the counter with sand on her boots and salt in her hair and asked for junk nails as if she were ordering silk. He charged her full price. 3 cents a pound, the same as straight nails, because he could, and because the men were watching, and because Beret had no leverage to argue. She paid with coins from the teacup and carried the nails home in a flour sack, $14 spent on bent nails and what was left of Pater's account at the store. $17 remained. The corridor was not yet framed. The storm was less than 2 days away, and every person in the settlement except her children believed she was building her own failure. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could not see what you were building? The morning of March 10th broke gray and still, the kind of stillness that fishermen distrust. The wind had paused, but the air tasted of metal, and the surf hit the outer bar with a low, steady percussion that Beret could feel through the cabin floor. She began at first light. The design was simple because it had to be. She could not build anything that required precision carpentry, seasoned lumber, or a second pair of experienced hands. What she could build was a tunnel, rough, functional, and packed thick enough that the wind would lose its force before it reached the cabin door. The frame used 4x4 posts from Pater's unfinished fish rack. She had 6 of them, each about 7 feet long. She set them in shallow holes 2 feet apart along a line extending from the cabin's front door toward the southeast, away from the prevailing northeast storm wind. The corridor would turn the wind before it reached the latch. That was Ragna's principle. You did not fight the gale. You made it go around. She planked the north-facing wall first because that was the storm side. Rough pine boards, uneven lengths, nailed to the posts with bent nails she straightened on a stone. The boards did not meet cleanly. Gaps showed between them, some as wide as a finger. That did not matter. The boards were not the insulation. They were the container. Between the outer boards and the inner boards, she left a cavity 12 inches wide. This was the space that would hold the eelgrass, 12 inches of packed dead grass, trapped between 2 layers of wood, sealed at the top with sailcloth and lath. She worked the way Pater had taught her to work on the boat. One task finished before the next began, each joint checked with her hand before she moved on. She did not rush. Rushing wasted nails, and she did not have nails to waste. By mid-morning, the north wall was framed and half-planked. The posts stood firm in the sandy soil. The corridor was beginning to look like what it was, a rough lean-to passage, 12 feet long, extending from the cabin door at a slight angle that would force anyone entering to walk parallel to the wind rather than into it. Eli brought water. Tomas watched from the cabin window, his breath fogging the glass. Beret's shoulders burned. Her palms had blistered where the hammer handle rubbed, and the blisters had broken and bled into her gloves. She had not eaten since a handful of cornmeal mush at dawn. The tide was coming in, and the lower windrow of eelgrass, the material she had not yet gathered, would be wet by afternoon. She had posts set and one wall half-planked. She needed both walls planked, both cavities packed, a roof framed and packed, an outer door built, and the whole structure sealed with sailcloth before the storm arrived. At her current pace, she would finish sometime around midnight. The storm was not going to wait until midnight. She drove the next nail and felt it bite crooked into green pine. She pulled it, straightened it, drove it again. The board held. She moved to the next. The wind had not come back yet, but out past the dunes, the horizon had gone the color of a bruise, and the surf was louder than it had been an hour ago. She had one day, maybe less. She was driving the 4th post on the south wall when the handcart appeared on the sand path. It came from the east, pulled by a woman who walked with the deliberate lean of someone who had been pulling loads for 50 years and had stopped noticing the effort. The cart held a folded piece of sailcloth, heavier canvas than Beret's dory sail, a coil of rope dark with tar, and a crooked wooden brace that looked like it had been pulled from the frame of a shed that no longer existed. Ragna Kvame was 64. She was shorter than Beret by a full head and wider through the hips, and she wore a wool coat that had been patched so many times it had become a garment made entirely of repairs. Her face was brown and seamed from decades of coastal wind. Her hands were thick. Her eyes were the color of the sea on an overcast day. Gray, steady, and difficult to look away from. She stopped the cart at the edge of the lot and studied the half-framed corridor without speaking. She looked at the posts. She looked at the planked north wall. She looked at the pile of sorted eelgrass beside the cabin, pale and dry, weighted with stones to keep the wind from scattering it. Then she looked at Beret. "Did you take the gray grass or the black weed?" Beret set down the hammer. "Gray eelgrass, not kelp." Ragna's mouth moved. Not a smile, not exactly, but something shifted in her expression the way light shifts when a cloud passes. She pulled the cart to the south side of the corridor frame and began untying the sailcloth without asking permission or explaining herself. "Prudence Nickerson told my neighbor you were ruining yourself with seaweed," Ragna said. "I came to see whether you were ruining yourself with seaweed or building something." "Building something." "Good. Your posts are too shallow. The storm will push the whole frame east if you do not brace the base." She handed Beret the crooked brace, a length of oak, curved by age, with notches already cut at both ends. It fit between the second and third posts on the north wall like it had been made for the purpose, and when Beret nailed it in, the frame stopped swaying in the rising breeze. Ragna did not ask to be thanked. She did not explain why she had come. She crouched beside the pile of sorted eelgrass and began picking through it with both hands, discarding pieces the way a woman discards bad fish, quickly, by feel, without hesitation. "This is sand-heavy," she said, tossing a clump. "This is kelp mixed in. This is good." She held up a ribbon of pale grass, dry and springy, about 18 inches long. "You want this. Smells of salt, not rot. Bends without snapping. Springs back when you squeeze it." Beret watched her work. Ragna's sorting was 3 times faster than hers had been. The good pile grew. The discard pile grew faster. "Where did you learn this?" Beret asked, although she already knew part of the answer, the part she had learned in the shed as a child. She wanted to hear Ragna say it now, in this context, with the storm approaching. Ragna did not look up. "Lessu. My mother's mother made roofs from this. Thick roofs, arm's length deep, laid in courses like shingles. They did not burn. They did not rot. They kept the rain out and the heat in. Women gathered it. Women built with it. The men were at sea." She said this without sentiment. It was a fact delivered the way all facts about survival are delivered, flatly, because the alternative to knowing it was dying. Ragna's first teaching took 10 minutes and saved Beret from a mistake that would have ruined the north wall. Beret had been planning to pack the eelgrass into the wall cavity the way she packed oakum into a seam, tight, compressed, jammed in with a stick until no air remained. Ragna stopped her before she started. "Show me how you would pack this bay." Beret took a forkful of eelgrass, pressed it into the cavity between the outer and inner planks, and stomped it down with her boot. "No," Ragna said. The word was not harsh. It was the word of a woman correcting a technique before it could cause harm. "Air is the blanket. You stomp the air out. You stomp the warmth out. You are making rope. Rope does not insulate. Rope conducts." She took the eelgrass back out of the cavity. She shook it. She laid it in by forkfuls, each one placed, not pressed. She tamped it lightly with her palm, just enough to fill the space evenly, not enough to crush the loft. Then she took a thin lath strip and pinned it horizontally across the cavity so the grass could not slump downward over time. Pack, tamp, pin, pack, tamp, pin. Every 18 inches, a lath pin. The grass holds itself up. The air stays inside. If you pack it flat, you have a wet rope in your wall. If you pack it right, you have 1,000 small rooms, each one holding still air. Still air does not steal. Beret repeated the process on the next section. Ragna watched, adjusted her hands once, and nodded. Better, faster now. We do not have time to be careful, so we will be accurate instead. The second teaching came at noon when the first wall was packed and pinned. Ragna lit a candle stub and held it at the base of the cabin door. The flame leaned hard to the left, away from the door, pulled by draft that came not through the door itself, but through the gap between the door frame and the unfinished wall above it. You see? Ragna said. The worst leak is not where you think. The door's bad, yes, but the pressure comes here. She moved the candle along the seam where the north wall met the door frame. The flame bent nearly horizontal. The wind hits the north wall, cannot get through, and curls around the corner to the door. It is not coming through the door. It is coming around the door. Your corridor must turn the wind before it reaches this corner. This was why the corridor angled southeast instead of running straight out from the door. The northeast wind would hit the corridor's outer wall, lose its force in the packed eelgrass, and any air that curled around the outer door would have to travel 12 feet through a still passage before reaching the cabin. By the time it arrived, it would be slow and cold, but no longer a gale. The passage is not a wall, Ragna said. It is a maze for wind. The wind enters. The wind turns. The wind cannot find the door. You do not stop the wind. You make it stupid. Beret almost laughed. She did not, because there was no time for laughter, but the image stayed. The storm, as something that could be confused, outwitted, turned around in a hallway of dead grass until it forgot what it had come for. By 1 o'clock, the south wall was framed and the first cavity was packed. Ragna worked alongside Beret, not ahead of her. She did not take over. She corrected when correction was needed and stayed silent when it was not. The relationship was not charity. Ragna had recognized competence, the correct answer about gray grass, the sorted pile, the fire test, and she responded to competence with respect. They ate nothing. Beret's cornmeal was for the children. Ragni had brought nothing except tools and canvas. By 3 o'clock, the second wall was packed and pinned, but the roof was not started. The corridor stood as a roofless trench of packed walls, 12 feet of insulated passage open to the sky. The eelgrass in the walls was dry and springy, pale gray behind the rough pine planks. It smelled of salt and something faintly mineral, like clean sand after rain. Tomas coughed from inside the cabin. Beret stopped hammering and listened. The cough was deeper than this morning. Wetter. She looked at Ragna. Roof first or more grass? Beret asked. Roof, Ragna said. Rain will ruin the walls by morning if they are open. They framed the roof with Pater's last 2 fish rack timbers, laid across the top of the corridor walls. The timbers were not long enough to span the full width, so Ragna showed Beret how to splice them with a lap joint, lashing the overlap with tarred rope. It held, but it sagged in the center. They propped it with a vertical post. The corridor now had a column in the middle, which made the passage narrower, but the roof sound. The roof cavity was deeper than the walls, 16 to 18 inches, because heat rose and the roof was where the most warmth would escape. They packed it with the best eelgrass, the driest and most springy, and pinned it with lath every 12 inches. Over the top went Ragna's sailcloth, heavier canvas than Beret's, laid in overlapping strips like shingles, with the overlap pointing away from the prevailing wind so rain would shed rather than seep. At dusk, Hiram Pike drove past on the beach road. He slowed his horse and looked at the corridor. It was standing. It was rough, planks of different lengths, visible rope lashings, a crooked center post, but it was standing. Tide will wet the whole mess, he said, loud enough to carry. He did not stop. Ragna did not look up. She was nailing the last sailcloth shingle to the roof frame with tacks she had brought in her coat pocket. He owns the note? She asked. Yes. He wants the lot? Yes. Ragna drove the tack home. Then he needs you to fail. Remember that when he offers kindness. Darkness came early. The overcast had thickened through the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock the light was gone. They worked by lantern. One lamp hung from the center post, throwing shadows that made the corridor look deeper than it was. The setbacks came in clusters. A gust, the first real gust of the approaching storm, caught the unsecured edge of the roof sailcloth and tore it free from 3 tacks. The canvas snapped like a sail in a squall and pulled one of the lath pins loose from the roof cavity. Eelgrass fell into the passage in a clump. Beret climbed onto the south wall and retacked the canvas while Ragna held the lantern below, and the wind tried to pull her coat over her head. Eli, carrying water from the well, stepped on a nail that had fallen point up in the sand beside the corridor. The nail went through her boot sole and into the ball of her foot. She did not scream. She sat down in the sand and pulled the nail out herself, then looked at the blood on her hand with an expression that was not pain, but fury. Fury at the nail, at the sand, at the project that had put sharp metal in her path. Beret cleaned the wound with boiled water and vinegar. She wrapped Eli's foot with a strip torn from a dish towel. Eli did not cry. She said, I can still carry water. Beret told her to stay inside with Thomas. The north wall bowed outward at the third bay. Beret had overpacked the center section. Too much grass, too tight, pressing against the inner planks with enough force to push the outer boards off their nails. She and Ragna pulled the cavity open, removed a third of the eelgrass, repacked it with proper loft, and renailed the outer boards. The tide reached the lower rack line at 8 o'clock. The eelgrass Beret had not yet gathered. 2 more cartloads, at least, sat in the surf zone, darkening as the water touched it. She ran to the beach with the flour sack and pulled what she could from the advancing water. She saved half of it. The rest went out with the waves. The stove went out at 9 because Beret had been outside for 4 hours and nobody had fed it. The cabin was cold when she stepped through the unfinished corridor for more wood. Thomas was awake, huddled in a blanket, breathing through his mouth. The sound was bad. She rebuilt the fire. She fed Thomas warm mush with a spoon. She went back outside. At 10 o'clock, Prudence Nickerson's teenage daughter appeared at the edge of the lantern light. She carried a basket covered with a cloth. Inside were 6 biscuits, still warm, and a coil of spare clothesline. Thin rope, but strong enough for lashings. Mama sent these, the girl said. She looked at the corridor with an expression that mixed curiosity with the second-hand embarrassment of a child whose mother has told her something is foolish. She said to tell you the biscuits are not approval. Beret took the basket. Tell your mother I said thank you. The girl left. Beret ate 1 biscuit standing in the corridor. The others she brought inside for the children. The clothesline she cut into 12-inch lengths and used to lash the roof frame at every joint. Prudence doubted the method. She would not watch children go hungry to prove a point. The biscuits were not endorsement. They were the minimum that decency required. But the clothesline, that was something else. Clothesline was useful. You did not send useful things to a lost cause. Captain Cobb returned at 10:30. He came on foot, his lantern swinging, his surfman's coat buttoned to the chin. He had been checking the beach road for early storm damage and saw the light from Beret's lot. He stood at the entrance of the corridor, the outer end open to the night air, and looked down its length toward the cabin door. The corridor was standing, both walls packed, the roof sealed with canvas, the center post braced, a lantern hung from a nail, and in its light the packed eelgrass behind the inner planks was visible through the gaps, pale, dry, dense enough to stop a hand pushed against it. Cobb walked the length of the passage. He put his palm against the inner wall. He crouched and looked at the sill, the bottom of the wall where moisture would collect. He stood and studied the roof, pressing upward with his fingers. The sailcloth held, the lath pins held, the grass did not fall. He came back to the outer entrance where Beret and Ragna stood. "You have made a hallway," he said. "You have not made heat." "I do not need heat," Beret said. "I need the wind to stop taking it." Cobb said nothing for a moment. He was a man who understood physics through experience rather than language, and what Beret had said was accurate in a way he could not immediately argue with. The wind was the problem. The door was where the wind entered. The corridor broke the wind's path. "The outer wall may tear free," he said. "This framing is not storm grade. If a gust catches that roof canvas, the whole structure peels off the cabin like a bandage." "I lashed every joint," Beret said. "The eelgrass is pinned with lath." "The eelgrass," Cobb said, and the word came out of him the way a doctor says the name of a remedy he does not trust. He looked at Ragna. "You taught her this." "She knew before I arrived," Ragna said. "I taught her to do it faster." Cobb looked at the sky. He could not see stars. The overcast was total, low, and moving. The barometer at the station had dropped further since afternoon. "Storm makes shore by morning," he said. "Maybe sooner. If this fails, come to the station. Do not wait." He left. He did not wish them luck. He was not a man who believed in luck. He believed in materials, construction, and the weight of evidence, and the evidence for a seaweed corridor was exactly 0 buildings he had seen survive a nor'easter. Beret watched his lantern disappear toward the station. Her hands were bleeding through the work gloves. Her back had seized on the right side from hammering overhead. She had not slept in 36 hours. The corridor stood behind her in the dark, smelling faintly of salt and pine tar, 12 feet of packed dead grass between her door and the sea. She did not know whether it would work. She went inside, fed the stove, and checked Tomas. His forehead was warm, not hot. Warm. The fever was thinking about coming but had not committed. She held his hand until he slept, and then she went back outside because the outer storm door was not finished. Ragna helped her build the outer door from planks and sailcloth. It was not elegant. It was a rectangle of pine nailed to a Z frame with canvas stretched across the outside and tacked at the edges. The hinges were rope loops through holes drilled with an awl. The latch was a wooden peg on a leather strap. They hung it at midnight. The corridor was now enclosed. 2 doors, 2 walls, a packed roof, 12 feet of still air between the cabin and the world. Beret shut the outer door and stood in the passage. The lantern flame burned straight up, no flicker, no lean. She held her hand at the seam of the cabin door and felt nothing. No draft, no pressure. The wind was outside, pressing against the corridor walls, and the corridor was absorbing it the way a closed fist absorbs a push, not by resisting, but by having no space for the force to enter. She opened the cabin door. The stove draft did not falter. No smoke crawled sideways. No ash scattered. For the first time since Pater died, Beret opened her front door and the heat stayed inside. She closed it. She opened the outer storm door, stepped into the wind, shut it behind her, walked back through the corridor, opened the cabin door. Still no draft. Ragna stood in the corridor with her arms crossed. The air between the doors is still, she said. The wind cannot push through 12 feet of packed grass and 2 closed doors. It will try. It will fail. Beret leaned against the corridor wall. She pressed her cheek to the rough plank, and behind it she could feel the eelgrass, dry, dense, faintly warm compared to the plank itself. 1,000 small rooms of trapped air, each one holding still. She wanted to believe it would hold. She went inside instead of hoping, and fed the stove, and waited. The nor'easter arrived on the outer cape as rain. It came after 1 in the morning on March 11th, 1888. Not the sharp, dramatic snow that the inland papers would later describe, but a horizontal rain mixed with salt spray that hit the cabin windows like gravel. The rain turned to sleet within the hour. The sleet turned to a hard, driving snow that came sideways from the northeast, mixed with sand scoured off the dunes. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived fully formed, a steady 40 miles an hour, with gusts that shook the cabin frame and drove surf over the beach road. Beret sat on the floor beside the stove, with Thomas on the cot above her, and Eli wedged against the south wall with a blanket over her head. She listened. The first thing she heard was the outer storm door. It banged once. Hard, a sound like a plank dropped on stone, and then held. The rope hinges stretched, and the canvas bulged inward, but the Z frame took the pressure and the latch peg caught the loop. The second thing she heard was nothing. No wind through the cabin door, no draft at the latch, no smoke crawling sideways. The stove drew cleanly, the chimney pulling air from the room and exhausting it straight up, and the room warmed the way a room should warm when the fire is working and the walls are holding. She put her hand against the cabin door. It was cold. The corridor beyond was not heated, but there was no pressure against it, no vibration, no air pushing through the seam. The storm was on the other side of the corridor walls, and the corridor walls were absorbing it in silence. The first hour passed. Beret fed the stove a single small log, a quarter of what she would have burned on a normal storm night with the wind cutting through the north wall. The cabin temperature held. Tomas breathed with the paper tear sound, but steadily, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of a child who is sick but not suffocating. The second hour brought the fever. Thomas woke crying at 3 in the morning with his forehead hot to the touch and his eyes glassy. His breathing went shallow and fast. Beret held him upright because he breathed better sitting than lying. She could not give him cold air. Cold air would seize his chest. She could not overheat the room. Too much fire-risked chimney backdraft in the high wind. She held the stove at a careful middle. Enough heat to keep the room above freezing. Not so much that the pipe joint, the cracked elbow she had never been able to replace, would leak smoke into the room. Eli boiled water for steam. They hung a damp cloth near the stove and let the moisture enter the air. Tomas's breathing eased by 0.5 degree. The third hour nearly broke the corridor. At 4 in the morning, a gust, stronger than anything in the first 2 hours, hit the outer wall and lifted the northwest corner of the roof. Beret heard it, a crack, then a flapping sound, then the whistle of wind entering the corridor through a gap between the roof canvas and the wall top. Cold air flooded the passage. She could feel it through the cabin door, a sudden pressure, a drop in temperature on the wood surface. She told Eli to shut the cabin door and hold it. She pulled her coat on, opened the door into the corridor, and shut it behind her. The corridor was black. The lantern had blown out. The wind was inside the passage now, whistling through the roof gap, pulling at the eelgrass in the wall tops. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, feeling the walls for the gap. She found it at the third bay. The roof plank had lifted 2 inches, and the sailcloth beneath it had torn free of its tacks. Wind drove sleet into the passage through the opening. Her hands were wet in seconds. She had rope in her coat pocket. She climbed onto the south wall, standing on the planks, her head above the roofline, the full storm hitting her face, and pulled the loose plank down. She held it with her body weight while she wrapped the rope around the plank and the wall timber beneath it, tying a knot she could barely feel with frozen fingers. The rope held. The plank held. The sailcloth was torn, but with the plank down, the gap was sealed enough to stop the main flow. She climbed back into the corridor. Her palms were raw where they had frozen to the wet rope. She crawled back to the cabin door, knocked twice, and Eli opened it. The cabin was still warm. That was the moment Beret understood what she had built. The roof had breached. Wind had entered the corridor, and the cabin door, closed, separated from the breach by 12 feet of packed eelgrass wall, had held its temperature. The corridor had taken the damage, so the cabin did not have to. It was not a wall. It was a sacrifice. It could be wounded and still protect what lay behind it. The fourth hour brought Hiram Pike's nephew. The pounding came at 5 a.m. on the outer storm door, a frantic, arrhythmic hammering that sounded like someone hitting the wood with an open hand rather than a fist. Beret heard it through 2 closed doors in the length of the corridor. She went through the passage in the dark. She reached the outer door and put her hand against it. The wood shook with each blow. She lifted the latch. The boy fell inward. He was 14, thin, blue at the lips, wearing a coat soaked through, and boots full of sand and water. His name was Josiah, and he had been sent by Hiram from the store to the harbor to check on a vessel, and the storm had caught him on the beach road between the two. He had been walking for an hour in conditions that killed men faster than water. If you are invested in this story, stay with us because opening that door may undo everything she built. Beret pulled him into the corridor. Snow and sleet came in behind him, a blast of horizontal white that filled the passage for the 3 seconds the door was open. She slammed the door shut and dropped the latch. The corridor was full of snow. Not a little, it's a real accumulation, knee-deep at the outer end, tapering to ankle depth at the cabin door. The temperature in the passage had dropped to match the outside. The walls were still packed, still holding, but the air between them was now storm air, cold and wet. "Eli!" Beret shouted through the cabin door. "Open the door! Close it behind us!" Ragna's voice came instead. She had come from the neighboring lot when the storm worsened, unwilling to leave Beret alone with 2 children. She had been inside the cabin for an hour, feeding the stove, watching Tomas. Ragna opened the cabin door. Beret shoved Josiah through. Ragna pulled the cabin door shut in one motion, not gently, but with the speed of a woman who understood that every second the door was open, heat left and wind entered. The cabin door closed. The stove flame flickered, then steadied. The room cooled by a few degrees. The brief opening had cost heat, but within 10 minutes the stove recovered. The cabin held. The corridor was damaged. Snow on the floor, cold air filling the passage, the repaired roof still groaning. But the cabin was intact. The airlock had worked the way an airlock works. The outer space took the storm, and the inner space was preserved. Josiah lay on the floor beside the stove, shaking so hard his teeth sounded like gravel in a tin cup. Eli brought the last blanket. Ragna heated water. Thomas watched the stranger from the cot with fever-bright eyes and said nothing. Beret went back into the corridor with a broom. She swept the snow toward the outer door and let it pile against the base. The snow would freeze there and seal the gap at the bottom, an accidental improvement. She packed loose eelgrass around the damaged roof section, replacing what the wind had pulled free. The repairs were ugly. They held. At 6 in the morning, the storm reached its peak. The wind was no longer gusting. It was continuous, a solid wall of air pressing against the outer corridor wall with enough force to make the packed eelgrass creak inside its planks. Sand and snow mixed against the north face. The surf had reached the beach road and flooded the low ground between the dunes. Prudence Nickerson's kitchen pump froze solid. A fisherman's shack on the next point, a building with proper chinking but no windbreak at the door, lost its stove draft when a gust reversed the chimney. The fire went out. The fisherman's wife and 3 children sat in darkness, wrapped in every blanket they owned, waiting. Captain Cobb's life-saving station took in 4 men from the harbor. The station was built to standard, with proper walls and a storm porch. It held. But even there, the men burned wood faster than expected because the wind found seams no one had patched. At 7, Hiram Pike himself arrived at Beret's outer door. He did not knock. He was carried. Cobb and Prudence's oldest son hauled him between them through the drifting sand and dropped him on the corridor floor. A flying plank from his woodshed, the roof had torn free in a gust, had hit him across the left shoulder and the side of his head. His ear was bleeding. His left arm hung at an angle that suggested something was cracked or broken beneath the coat. They brought him through the corridor and into the cabin. Cobb shut the cabin door behind them and looked at the room. No frost on the latch. No smoke in the air. The stove burning low and clean. 2 children asleep on the cot. Thomas's breathing rough but steady. Eli's bandaged foot tucked beneath her. Josiah wrapped in a blanket by the wall, color returning to his face, and the cabin warm enough that Cobb unbuttoned his coat within a minute of entering. Hiram Pike lay on the floor of the cabin he had tried to take from Beret. His head rested 6 inches from the base of the wall that connected to the corridor he had called a stinking ocean hallway. The eelgrass he had mocked was packed 12 inches thick on the other side of the planks his shoulder pressed against. He smelled the salt. He smelled the faint mineral scent of dried seagrass. He was conscious enough to know where he was, and too hurt to care about the irony. Ragna cleaned his wound with warm water and vinegar. Beret set his arm in a sling made from a dish towel. Neither woman mentioned his name, his store, his ledger, or his offer of 2 cords on credit. The storm continued through the day. By noon, the snow had shifted to freezing rain, then back to snow. The wind eased to 30 miles an hour, still brutal, still enough to kill exposed skin in minutes, but no longer the continuous wall of force it had been at dawn. Beret burned less than half the wood Captain Cobb had predicted. The stove ran low and steady because the draft held. The draft held because the door opened into a still corridor instead of a gale. The corridor was cold inside, near freezing in the passage itself, but the walls were dry. The eelgrass had not collapsed. The roof, patched and ugly, had not torn free again. The snow that had entered during Josiah's rescue had frozen at the base of the outer door and created a seal that actually reduced drafts at the bottom. At dusk, Cobb opened the cabin door to check the corridor. He held his lantern into the passage and looked at the walls, the roof, the frozen snow at the outer end. He pressed his hand against the inner wall. Dry. He pressed his hand against the outer wall. Cold, but intact. He came back inside and shut the door. "How much wood have you burned since midnight?" he asked. Beret counted the logs beside the stove. 4, she said. "Small ones." Cobb looked at the stove. He looked at the room. He looked at the children asleep on the cot. Thomas breathing with the paper tear sound, but breathing, not gasping, not blue, not cold. He said nothing. He sat down on the floor beside Hiram Pike and closed his eyes. At dawn on March 12th, 1888, the wind dropped to 15 miles an hour. The snow stopped. The sky was still gray, but the violence had passed. Beret opened the cabin door into the corridor for the first time since the rescue. The passage was cold, crusted with frozen sleet on the floor, scarred where the roof plank had lifted, but the walls were intact. The eelgrass behind the planks was dry. The packed cavities had not slumped, had not soaked through, had not collapsed under the weight of snow and wind. She walked to the outer door and opened it. The world outside was white and gray and scoured. Sand drifts mixed with snow covered the beach road. The dunes had shifted. Prudence's kitchen chimney showed no smoke. Her fire was still out. Beret went back inside through the corridor. She shut both doors. She fed the stove. She sat down on the floor beside Eli, who was awake and watching her with the expression of a child who has decided not to be frightened because frightened is the luxury she cannot afford. "Is it over?" Eli asked. "The storm is," Beret said. "The rest is not." Tomas coughed twice and settled. His forehead was cooler than it had been at 3 in the morning. The fever had crested and begun to fall. In the corner, Hiram Pike slept with his mouth open and his broken arm cradled against his chest, breathing the salt-scented air of the corridor that had kept him alive. The storm held the Cape for 3 days. When it released its grip on March 14th, the damage emerged in stages, first visible from doorways, then from the roads, then from the harbor, where boats sat in positions that no owner had chosen, and some sat in no position at all because they were gone. Beret did not survey the damage. She fed the stove. She fed the children. She changed the dressing on Eli's foot and checked the wound for redness. She spooned warm broth into Thomas, who accepted it with the passive obedience of a child whose body has decided to recover and whose mind has not yet caught up. His breathing was still rough, but the fever had broken during the second night, and the paper tear sound had softened to something closer to the rasp of a child with a bad cold, rather than a child in danger. Hiram Pike left on the morning of the 14th. Prudence's son came with a wagon, and Hiram climbed onto it without looking at Beret, without speaking to Ragna, and without glancing at the corridor. His arm was splinted. His ear was scabbed. He held the sling against his chest with his good hand and stared at the road ahead as the wagon pulled away. He said nothing. The silence was louder than any insult he had delivered at Nye's store. Ragna watched him go. "He will be back," she said. "Men like that always come back. The question is whether they come back angry or ashamed." Captain Cobb returned on the 15th of March with a notebook. He did not announce his purpose. He walked the length of the corridor with the slow, deliberate attention of a man performing an inspection he intended to record. He pressed his palm against both walls at 3 heights, knee, chest, and shoulder. He crouched at the sill and looked for water damage. He pulled one of the lath pins free, examined the eelgrass behind it, dry, springy, pale, and pressed it back into place. He measured the woodpile. Beret had started the storm with 1 1/4 cords. She had burned through the 3-day storm and the day after. What remained was just over 3/4 of a cord. Cobb wrote in his notebook. He calculated. "You should have burned close to a full cord in 3 days with that stove and that wind," he said. "You burned less than half that." "The stove did not fight the door," Beret said. "It only fought the walls." Cobb stood in the corridor with his notebook and looked at the packed eelgrass through the plank gaps. He had spent 30 years pulling men from the sea and assessing structures that the sea had tried to destroy. He understood force, resistance, and material behavior in the way that practitioners understand them, not through equations but through repetition. He had seen 100 storm porches. He had seen properly chinked cabins lose their draft and improperly chinked cabins survive by luck. He had never seen a packed seaweed corridor used as an airlock and wind baffle on the outer cape. I told you a wall had to be tight, dry, and braced, Cobb said. He tapped the inner plank with his knuckle. The eelgrass behind it made no sound, just the dense, soft absorption of packed material doing its work. You made one out of what I stepped over on the beach. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not say she was clever. He said her method had met the requirements by a route he had not considered, and he wrote the measurements in his notebook: wall thickness, cavity depth, roof cavity depth, approximate wood consumption, condition of materials after the storm. The life-saving station could use this on the bunkroom wall, he said. The northeast side takes spray all winter. We lose heat there faster than anywhere else in the building. Beret said nothing for a moment. Cobb was not offering praise. He was offering application. He was saying, "This works, and I have a building that needs it." "I will show you how to pack it," she said. "But the packing matters more than the material. If your men ram it tight, it becomes rope. Rope does not insulate." Cobb wrote that down too. Prudence Nickerson came on the 16th. She came without her daughter, without biscuits, without the protective distance of a woman sending charity through a proxy. She came alone in her work dress, and she stood in the corridor and put both hands against the walls and held them there. "My kitchen pump froze," she said. "We lost the stove for 6 hours. The children slept in their coats on the floor beside the chimney stones. My husband's boat is in Gloucester, and he does not know what happened." She took her hands off the wall. She looked at Beret. "How thick?" 12 inches for the walls, 16 for the roof, eelgrass, not kelp, pale, dry, shaken clean, packed loose with air inside, pinned with lath every 18 inches. Prudence absorbed this the way she absorbed all practical information, completely, without commentary, storing it behind the same expression she used when memorizing the price of salt cod. "I want one for my kitchen entrance," she said. "Smaller than this, just enough to break the draft at the door." "I will show you how. You build it yourself." Prudence nodded. That was the correct answer. She did not want Beret to build it for her. She wanted to know how. There was a difference, and both women understood it. Within the week, 3 households had sent someone to look at the corridor. 2 fishermen's wives came together, stepping through the passage with the careful attention of women evaluating something they would need to replicate with no help and no margin for error. A station man came with Cobb's notebook and asked questions about lath, spacing, and cavity depth. A widow from the next point came alone, said nothing, put her hand inside the inspection hatch Ragina had built into the 4th bay, felt the dry eelgrass, and left. She came back 2 days later with a question about where to find the best grass on the tide line. Bray showed everyone the same way. She did not lecture. She opened the inspection hatch on the 4th bay and let them feel the material. Plank, sailcloth, loose eelgrass, lath, air. She pressed a fistful of good eelgrass into their hands, and then a fistful of kelp, and asked them to tell her the difference. Everyone could. The eelgrass was light, dry, ribboned, salty. The kelp was dark, damp, rubbery, and it smelled like something the tide regretted. She did not charge. Ragna had told her months ago in the shed, in a conversation Beret barely remembered until now, that the women of Lesso did not sell the grass. They gathered it together. They built together. The knowledge was not a commodity. It was a practice. Beret made one rule. She would not help anyone who packed the cavity tight. Air was the blanket. If they could not accept that, they were building wet rope into their walls, and she would not put her name beside it. Hiram Pike's reaction to Beret's growing reputation was not conversion. It was something closer to the response of a man who discovers that a debt he holds has become less valuable because the debtor has become essential. He did not come to inspect the corridor. He did not ask how it worked. He came to Nye's store and sat by the stove and listened to other men describe it, and each description tightened something in his face that was not curiosity but calculation. Hiram still held the note on Beret's cabin. The note was still due. The storm had not erased the debt, but foreclosing on a widow who had just sheltered his own nephew and saved his own life during the worst nor'easter in memory was a different proposition than foreclosing on a woman the town considered foolish. The social math had changed. Not the financial math, the social math. Hiram could read a ledger, but he could also read a room, and the room at Nye's store was no longer laughing at Beret's Seaweed hallway. He said nothing publicly. He adjusted the payment schedule on the note, extending it by 6 months without reducing the amount. And he told Beret through the storekeeper, not in person. The message was clear. He was not forgiving the debt. He was waiting. Beret received the message and said nothing. 6 months of breathing room was 6 months she had not expected. She could work. She could mend nets, clean fish, take in washing. She could survive until the note came due again. The corridor had bought her time, not freedom. Time. Ragna stayed. She did not move into Beret's cabin. She stayed in the neighboring lot, in a room she rented from a fisherman's widow who spent winters with a daughter in Plymouth. But she came every morning before light, and she stayed until dark, and the work she and Beret did together in March and April of 1888 was not repair. It was education. They rebuilt the corridor section by section. Ragna showed Beret what the storm had revealed, which joints failed first, where water had entered, where the eelgrass had slumped because the lath pins were too far apart. Each weakness became a lesson. Each repair became a principle. The sill is where you lose a wall, Ragna said on a morning in late March, crouching beside the corridor's base. Water from melting snow had pooled at the south corner, and the lowest eelgrass was damp, not rotten, not ruined, but darker than the grass above it. The ground sends water up. The rain sends water down. The sill sits between them and gets both. Raise the sill, set it on stones. Keep air beneath the frame. They lifted the south wall together, drove stones under each post, and let the frame settle onto a base that was 4 inches above the sand. The air gap beneath the sill would drain moisture instead of holding it. Inspection boards, Ragna said on another morning. She had brought a short plank with 2 pegs, a panel that could be pulled free from the wall without tools, revealing the cavity behind it. You must see what is inside. Every season, pull the boards. Look for black spots, smell for rot. Pull out what is bad. Put in what is dry. A wall you cannot inspect is a wall you cannot trust. Beret fitted the inspection boards at every 4th bay on both walls. The corridor now had 8 hatches, small windows into the packed eelgrass, each one a checkpoint. These afternoons together were the quietest hours Beret had known since Peter's death. She and Rana worked side by side with the economy of 2 people who understand the same task and do not need to discuss it. They spoke in fragments, half sentences about material, weather, and method, and the fragments were enough. Ragna told stories from Lesu in the same tone she discussed lath spacing, without sentiment, as information. The roofs on Lesu were arm-thick, she said. The eelgrass turned gray-brown and hardened with age, and roofs lasted 60 years or more. Women gathered the grass after autumn storms. Women packed it. Women maintained it. The men built the frames, but the women knew the grass the way the men knew the sea, by feel, by smell, by the quality of the strand in the hand. My mother's mother told me the grass knows when it is packed wrong, Ragna said once, threading a lath pin through the fourth bay. She was wrong, of course. The grass knows nothing, but your hands know. When the loft is right, you can feel it give and spring. When the loft is wrong, it feels dead, like packing mud. If your hands tell you it is dead, pull it out and start again. Beret learned to trust her hands. She could reach into a packed bay, press the eelgrass, and tell whether the loft was correct within seconds. Too tight, dense, resistant, no spring. Too loose. Fingers pass through without resistance, correct? A firm give, like pressing a pillow that pushes back. They disagreed once. Beret wanted to seal the outer wall completely. No gaps, no ventilation, every seam chinked tight with oakum and tar. Ragna refused. You are sealing a living wall like a coffin, Ragna said. The grass must breathe. If moisture enters, and moisture will enter, because wind carries rain and tide carries spray, the moisture must leave. If you seal the outside, the moisture stays. The grass rots, the rot spreads. In 2 years, your wall is a compost pile. But wind enters through the gaps, Beret said. A little wind through the outermost layer is not the same as a gale through the door. A little air movement dries the outer grass. That is the defense. You are building a wall that heals itself. The outer layer dries in the breeze. The inner layer stays still. If you seal it, you stop both. You stop the healing and the breathing, and then you have rot, Beret argued. She had spent the entire storm terrified of wind entering the corridor. The idea of deliberately leaving gaps felt like leaving a wound open. Ragna held a piece of eelgrass to the light. What do you see? Beret looked. The strand was flat, ribboned, pale. Tiny veins ran along its length. A dead plant, Beret said. A structure, Ragna said. Inside this ribbon are pockets, millions of them, small rooms of air, held in place by the fiber. The pockets do not move. They do not leak. They are the insulation. The outer wind does not reach them because they are nested, Baum, pocket, inside pocket, all the way to the center of the wall. A little wind on the outer surface does not penetrate 12 inches of nested pockets. It dries the outer skin and stops. Beret understood. The wall was not a single barrier. It was a gradient, wet on the outside, dry on the inside, with 1,000 layers of trapped air between. The outer layer sacrificed itself to moisture and wind, so the inner layers stayed dry and still. She left the outer gaps open. Ragna was right. The wall breathed, and the breathing kept it dry. Ragna died in the first week of May, 1888. The pneumonia had been building since the storm. Weeks of wet labor, hauling eelgrass in rain, kneeling on damp sand, sleeping in a room that was not hers and not warm enough, had settled in her chest the way weather settles on a coast. She coughed through April. She worked through the coughing. She taught through the work. On the last day she came to the corridor, she brought Beret a wooden needle. It was 8 inches long, carved from a piece of ash with a blunt point and a wide eye. It was the tool used on Lezu to stitch eelgrass into bundles for roofing. A tool Ragna's mother had made and Ragna had carried across the Atlantic. Do not let men turn this into a secret they can charge widows for, Ragna said. She was sitting on the corridor floor because standing made her cough until she could not breathe. The grass is free. The knowledge is free. The labor is yours. If a man tells you he owns the method, he is lying. The sea gives the grass. The women give the work. Nobody owns what the sea throws away. Beret took the needle. It was smooth from decades of handling, dark with oil from Ragna's hands. Ragna died in the rented room 4 days later. The fisherman's widow was with her. Beret was not, because Ragna had not sent for her, and Beret understood later that this was deliberate, that Ragna had not wanted the last image to be the dying, but the teaching. The needle sat on Beret's table beside a cup of tea that no one drank. The corridor smelled of salt. Maylight came through the inspection hatches in thin bars and fell across the packed eelgrass, dry, pale, still springing back when pressed. Beret closed the hatches. She sat in the corridor alone. She did not cry. She pressed her hand against the wall the way Ragna had pressed her hand against the wall of the shed 30 years ago, and felt the same thing, cold on her side, still on the other, and between them the packed patience of a material that asked for nothing except to be left alone with its air. Summer passed. Barrett mended nets. She cleaned fish for the harbor crews. She took in washing from the station men. She paid down Pater's note at Hiram Pike's ledger, slowly, in coins that hurt to part with. The corridor stood through heat and rain and the indifferent winds of July. She dried eelgrass on racks in the yard, Ragna's way, spread flat, turned daily, dried until it whispered when shaken. She marked bundles by quality, roof pack, wall pack, discard. By autumn, she had a stock of dry eelgrass sufficient to repack the entire corridor and build a second one. She did not build a second one. She did not need to. But the stock was there, sorted and covered, a resource that cost nothing except labor and knowledge. She taught. Prudence built a small vestibule at her kitchen door, 4 feet long, 8 inches of packed cavity on both walls. It was ugly, and it worked. The station men packed a bay on the northeast bunkroom wall under Cobb's supervision. Cobb reported that the bunkroom held heat measurably better during the autumn gales. 3 families attempted their own versions without asking Beret's guidance. 2 failed. Cavities packed too tight, sills sitting on wet ground, kelp mixed in with eelgrass. The 3rd succeeded because the builder's wife had watched Beret through the inspection hatch and copied the loft by feel. Beret corrected the failures without judgment. She pulled the packed cavities open, showed the builders the blackened kelp, the slumped grass, the wet sill, and she repacked them properly. She did not say the word she had learned from Ragna. Air is the blanket. Until the builder could feel the difference in their own hands. Then she said it, and it meant something, because they had felt the wrong way first. The secondary crisis came in the winter of 1890. Prudence Nickerson's kitchen stovepipe cracked along a seam that had been patched twice and should have been replaced. A coal fell through the crack onto the wooden shelf below. The shelf caught. The wall behind the shelf, pine boards chinked with mud, began to char. Prudence smelled the smoke before she saw the flame. She pulled her 2 youngest children out the kitchen door and into the yard. Her oldest son threw water on the wall. The fire had reached the entry vestibule, Beret's design, 8 inches of packed eelgrass between pine planks. The pine sheathing scorched, the outer boards blackened, but the eelgrass behind them did not flash. It did not leap to flame the way straw or hay or dry pine shavings would have. It charred at the surface, a slow, dense smolder that produced smoke, but not combustion. The char layer thickened and insulated the grass behind it, slowing the heat transfer into the deeper cavity. The fire did not stop because of the eelgrass. It stopped because neighbors arrived with buckets, and Prudence's son kept throwing water until the flames were out. But the eelgrass had slowed the spread by minutes, minutes that meant the difference between a scorched wall and a collapsed kitchen. Beret examined the damage the next morning. She pulled the inspection board and looked at the cavity. The outer 2 inches of eelgrass were blackened and crisp. The inner 6 inches were untouched, dry, pale, springy. The gradient had worked in reverse. Instead of protecting against cold, the layered structure had slowed the heat of the fire, each inch of packed grass absorbing energy and charring before passing it inward. She said nothing dramatic. She showed Prudence the 2 layers, black outer, pale inner, and Prudence looked at them the way she had looked at the eelgrass demonstration a year ago, with the silence of a woman who cannot explain what she sees, but cannot deny it. Replace the outer 2 inches, Beret said. The inner packing is sound. Raise the sill here, water pooled during the fire, and the bottom is damp. Check every inspection board. If it smells sour, pull it out. She was teaching now without thinking about teaching. The instructions came from her hands the way Ragna's instructions had come from hers, precisely, without preamble, as practice rather than theory. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm arrives. Hiram Pike saw something in the fire's aftermath that was not heroism or community spirit. He saw demand. 3 more households asked about eelgrass packing within a week of Prudence's kitchen fire. The fear of fire was greater than the fear of cold, and a material that slowed fire as well as wind was a material people would want. Hiram did what Hiram did. He went to the beach, gathered cartloads of what he found at the tide line, and packed it into wooden crates. He nailed a board to the front of each crate, seaweed walling, $1, and stacked them beside the cordwood at his yard. The crates contained wet kelp, black, rubbery, reeking of decay. Hiram had not sorted it. He had not dried it. He had not distinguished eelgrass from kelp because he did not know there was a distinction. He had seen Beret use beach material and concluded that beach material was beach material. 2 men bought crates. One packed his entry wall with wet kelp and covered it with boards. Within a week, the smell was unbearable, a thick, rotten stench that seeped through the planks and drove his wife and children to sleep at a neighbor's house. The kelp held moisture like a sponge. The boards warped. Mold crept along the sill in white threads. The second buyer did not pack his wall. He opened the crate, smelled the contents, and brought it back to Hiram's yard. He set it on the counter at Nye's store and said, loud enough for everyone present, "This is not what the Halverson woman uses. This is rot in a box." Hiram's face went rigid. He was a man who understood trade and leverage, and he had misread the product entirely. He had assumed the value was in the material. The value was in the knowledge. Which material, how dry, how packed, how loose, how pinned. Beret did not attack Hiram publicly. She did something more effective. She stood at Nye's store the following Saturday with a handful of dry eelgrass and a handful of wet kelp and laid them side by side on the counter. She did not say Hiram's name. She did not mention his crates. "Eelgrass," she said, touching the pale ribbon. "Dry, sorted, shaken clean. This is what goes in a wall." She touched the kelp. "This is what the tide throws up beside it. It looks similar. It is not similar. This holds water. This rots. This is not insulation. This is a mistake." The men at the stove looked at the kelp. They looked at the eelgrass. The difference was obvious when presented side by side, obvious in color, in texture, in weight, in smell. It had not been obvious when a man who sold things told them it was all the same. Hiram was not at the store that day. He heard about it by evening. His crates sat unsold beside the cordwood for 2 weeks before he quietly removed them. Beret did not gloat. She had learned from Ragna that knowledge protected itself, that the method's specificity was its defense against men who wanted to sell what they did not understand. You could not fake the loft. You could not fake the sort. You could not buy competence in a crate. But Hiram's failure had damaged something fragile. The two men who had tried his product now distrusted all eelgrass packing, the good and the bad. The word seaweed carried a stench that had nothing to do with Beret's walls and everything to do with Hiram's kelp. The idea's reputation had been wounded by a bad copy, and Beret would spend the rest of that winter rebuilding trust one inspection hatch at a time. She opened her corridor to anyone who wanted to see it, smell it, and put their hands inside. She walked them through the sorting. She let them press the loft. She showed them the inspection boards Ragna had designed, and the stone sills she had added, and the ventilated outer layer that breathed and dried and healed itself. The method was slow to spread because the method required teaching, and teaching required trust, and trust had been damaged by a man who thought he could put the sea in a crate and call it a wall. Beret did not rush. She had learned patience from the eelgrass itself, a material that worked not through force or heat, but through the accumulated stillness of 10,000 small pockets of trapped air, each one holding its ground, each one doing its small part, and none of them in a hurry. The winter of 1891 brought the storm that finished Hiram Pike's pride. It was not as severe as the 1888 nor'easter. No telegraph operator compared it to a national catastrophe. No newspaper ran breathless columns about paralyzed cities. It was an ordinary Cape Cod gale, northeast wind, freezing rain turning to snow, temperatures dropping into the low teens overnight, surf high enough to wash the beach road, but not high enough to flood the dunes. The kind of storm that came 3 or 4 times a winter and separated the houses that were built right from the houses that were not. Hiram's store had a new entry that year. He had spent money on it, proper sawn boards, fitted joints, a heavy door with iron hinges. It looked like craftsmanship. The boards were tight. The door was plumb. The entry was everything Cobb had described as necessary, tight, dry, and braced. It was not insulated. The boards conducted cold the way boards conduct cold, directly, completely, without resistance. The fitted joints stopped wind, but not temperature. The heavy door sealed the gap, but created a thermal bridge that pulled heat from the store interior every hour of every cold day. Hiram had built a box. The box stopped drafts. The box did not stop conduction. On the second night of the gale, the temperature inside the store entry dropped below freezing. The latch frosted over. The door swelled with moisture that had condensed on the cold boards and then frozen. By morning, the entry was sealed shut, not by storm, not by snow, but by ice that had formed on a surface too cold to resist it. Hiram could not open his own front door. He went out the back. He walked around the building in the wind and beat the ice off the latch with a hammer. The door opened, but the entry was a tunnel of frost, white on the walls, white on the ceiling, white on the floor where condensation had pooled and frozen into a sheet. He closed the store for the day. He sat behind the counter with the back door propped open for air because the front entry was an ice box he had paid good money to build. The news traveled the way all news travels in a small community, not through announcement, but through observation. Men who came to the store saw the back door open and the front entry shut. They asked why. Hiram said the latch was frozen. They looked at the entry and saw the frost on the boards and understood that the latch was not the problem. Hiram came to Beret's cabin on the third day. He did not come publicly. He came at dusk when the road was empty and the neighbors were inside. He stood at the outer end of the corridor he had called a stinking ocean hallway, the corridor he had said would freeze harder than a coffin lid, and he knocked on the storm door and waited. Beret opened the outer door. Hiram stood in the sand with his hat in his good hand. The arm had healed, but he still favored it, and his face carried the expression of a man who has rehearsed a speech and cannot remember how it began. "I need you to look at my entry," he said. Beret did not make him repeat it. She did not remind him of his words. She did not mention the kelp crates or the debt or the offer of 2 cords that would have cost her the cabin. She said, "Tomorrow morning, bring a lantern." She shut the door. The corridor swallowed the sound of the wind. Beret inspected Hiram's store entry the next morning with the same method Ragna had taught her: candle, hand, nose. She moved the candle along every seam. She pressed her palm against every board. She crouched at the sill and looked for the moisture path. "Your boards are tight," she said. "That is the problem." Hiram stared at her. "Tight is the problem?" "Tight stops wind. Tight does not stop cold. Cold moves through the wood itself. Your boards are a bridge between the outside air and the inside air. Every degree of cold on the outside walks across the wood and arrives on the inside. The moisture in your store air hits the cold boards and becomes water. The water freezes. You have built an ice factory." She spoke in Ragna's cadence, precise, practical, without scorn. The explanation was simple because the principle was simple. A barrier that stopped air movement but not heat transfer was half a solution, and half a solution in winter was sometimes worse than none because it created confidence without protection. "You need a dead space between the boards and the store," Beret said. "A cavity, packed with material that holds air but does not conduct cold. Your boards stay cold on the outside. The cavity holds still air. The store stays warm on the inside. The moisture never meets the cold surface because the cold surface is on the other side of a foot of trapped air." Hiram looked at the frost on his boards. He looked at Beret. The calculation in his face was visible. The cost of asking for help weighed against the cost of another frozen entry, another lost day of business, another round of quiet mockery at Nye's store. "Show me," he said. "No," Beret said. "I will not build it for you. I will show you how to sort the grass and how to pack the cavity. You will do the labor yourself." Hiram's jaw tightened. He was not a man who did his own labor. He hired men. He paid wages. He gave orders. "Every bundle must be opened by hand," Beret said. "Every strand sorted by feel. If you hire a boy to do it, the boy will mix in kelp and pack it tight because that is faster. You will have rot in the wall by April. Your hands are nobody's hands." Hiram stood in his frozen entry and looked at the woman he had tried to foreclose on. She was offering him exactly what he had refused to believe: that the method worked, that the material was free, that the knowledge required effort rather than money. She was making him do it himself because Ragna had taught her that the method survived only when the builder understood it. "I thought the trick was seaweed," Hiram said. The word came out of him slowly, like a debt being paid in small coins. It was knowing which seaweed and how not to smother it. He worked for 3 days. Beret came each morning, inspected his sorting, corrected his packing twice, and left. She did not help him carry grass from the beach. She did not help him frame the cavity. She watched his hands when he packed the first bay and told him to pull it out and start over because the loft was dead. He pulled it out. He started over. The second attempt was better. The third was correct. When he pressed the eelgrass and it sprang back against his palm, his face changed. Not to gratitude, not to conversion in any dramatic sense, but to the recognition of a man who has finally understood what a thing is and is angry at himself for how long it took. Hiram's store entry never froze again. He did not thank Beret publicly. He adjusted the payment schedule on Pater's note again, this time reducing the amount by 1/3, not extending the time. He told the storekeeper, not Beret. The message arrived the way Hiram's messages always arrived, through intermediaries, without warmth, as arithmetic rather than feeling. Beret received it. She did not comment. A third of the debt erased was a third of the weight lifted. She would take the arithmetic. The warmth she did not need from Hiram Pike. Tollef Lunde arrived in Truro in the spring of 1891. He was 38, a cooper by trade and a boat repairman by necessity, because the Cape needed more boat repair than barrel making, and a man who could bend wood for staves could bend wood for planking. He was quiet in the way that men who work with their hands are quiet, not shy, not sullen, but conserving language for the moments it was needed, and spending the rest of his time listening. He had heard about the Eelgrass corridor from a station man in Wellfleet. He came to see it because he was curious about the framing, how a structure made from scavenged dory ribs and fish rack posts could survive a nor'easter when proper built porches failed. Beret showed him the corridor, the way she showed everyone. Inspection hatches open, material visible, questions answered with demonstration rather than description. Tollef studied the joints. He ran his hand along the lap splice where Ragna had shown Beret how to extend the roof timbers. He crouched at the stone sills and looked at the air gap. "The framing is ugly," he said. It was not an insult. It was an observation delivered in the same tone he would use to describe a boat hull that leaked but floated. "It works," Beret said. "It works because the packing forgives the framing," Tollef said. "If the walls were empty, these joints would leak in every wind. The eelgrass fills the gaps the carpentry cannot." Beret looked at him. This was the first time anyone had articulated what she had felt, but not said, that the material compensated for the imperfection of the structure, that the forgiveness of the packing was itself a feature. "If the framing were better," Tollef said, "the packing would last longer. The joints would hold tighter. The inspection boards would sit flush instead of crooked. The whole assembly would be something a man could build in a day instead of 3. He was not offering to replace her work. He was offering to improve the container so that her material could do its job more efficiently. It was a partnership proposal disguised as a structural observation. "Build me a panel," Beret said. "One bay, proper framing, tight joints, removable boards. I will pack it. If the packing sits right and the inspection works, build me 11 more." Tollef built the panel in an afternoon. It was clean work. Mortise joints, plain surfaces. A removable inspection board that slid out on grooves instead of pulling free on pegs. The cavity was exactly 12 inches deep, uniform, with lath channels routed into the uprights so the pins sat flush. Beret packed it. The eelgrass fit the cavity like it had been grown for the purpose. Even distribution, proper loft, no slumping, no pressure against the boards. She closed the inspection hatch. It slid home without resistance. She opened it again. She pressed the eelgrass. It sprang back. "Build 11 more," she said. The courtship happened inside the work. Tollef came every week through the spring and summer. He built panels. Beret packed them. They replaced the original corridor section by section, Petter's rough framing giving way to Tollef's clean joinery, the rope lashings replaced by proper hardware, the crooked center post removed because the new roof timbers spanned the full width without support. The corridor kept its shape. It kept its smell, salt and dry grass, and the faint mineral scent of clean sand. It kept its function, but it became, under Tollef's hands, something that could be replicated. A design with consistent dimensions, standard joints, and removable parts that any competent carpenter could build if someone taught them how to pack the cavities. Beret rejected his first design for the inspection boards. The boards slid too smoothly. A satisfying fit, but one that sealed the cavity airtight when closed. She made him add a gap at the top of each board, a 1/4 inch of open space that allowed the outer layer of eelgrass to breathe. "You are building furniture," she said. I need walls. Tolliff looked at the gap. He understood. He modified the design. The second version had the gap, and the eelgrass behind it stayed drier through the humid summer than any section of the original corridor. He respected her knowledge the way she respected his craft, completely, without negotiation, as a fact that required no discussion. When she told him the loft was wrong, he did not argue. When he told her a joint would fail, she did not argue. They worked in the space between their skills, and the space was productive because neither one tried to occupy the other's ground. They married in the autumn of 1891, in a ceremony at the church in Truro that was attended by Prudence Nickerson, Captain Cobb, 3 station men, Eli, Thomas, and no one from Hiram Pike's side of the community. The marriage was not romantic in the way that stories require romance. It was practical in the way that coastal marriages were practical. 2 people whose skills fit together, whose labor combined was greater than the sum, and whose respect for each other was demonstrated daily through work rather than spoken in words. By 1893, Beret's yard had become a seasonal operation. Every autumn, after the beach storms deposited fresh windrows of eelgrass along the tide line, Beret organized the gathering. Women and children came with carts and sacks. They pulled the eelgrass from the rack line, separated it from kelp and debris on the beach, and hauled it to drying racks that Tolliff had built in the yard, long, low frames of pine lath where the grass was spread flat and turned daily until it whispered when shaken. The dried grass was sorted by quality. Roof pack, the longest, most uniform ribbons, went into bundles tied with twine. Wall pack, shorter strands, still springy, still pale, went into loose sacks. Discard. Anything sandy, dark, brittle, or sour-smelling went back to the beach. Children turned the grass with forks. They complained about the salt on their hands and the way the dry ribbons stuck to their sleeves. Eli, now 12, managed the sorting with the quiet authority of a girl who had watched her mother work since the morning after her father drowned. She could tell good grass from bad by feel alone, without looking, the way Ragna had done. Beret taught in the yard and in the homes where the packed walls went. She taught Prudence's daughter. She taught the station men who built panels for the bunk room. She taught a fisherman's widow from Wellfleet who had heard about the fire and wanted protection for her children's bedroom wall. She taught a man from Provincetown who arrived skeptical and left with his hands full of eelgrass and his head full of lath spacing. She taught the way Ragna had taught, through action, through correction, through the insistence that every builder feel the loft in their own hands before they closed a single cavity. She refused to pack walls for other people. She showed them how. They packed their own. The method spread along the outer cape the way practical knowledge spreads in isolated communities, slowly, by demonstration, through the trust that comes from watching something work in a neighbor's house before trying it in your own. By 1895, more than a dozen households had some version of an eelgrass-packed entry, wall bay, or storm vestibule. Not all were elegant, some were crooked, some used framing that Tolliff would have rebuilt, but they were inspectable, repairable, built from free material and maintained by the people who lived inside them. Beret heard in 1894 that a company in Boston had begun manufacturing something called Cabot's quilt, eelgrass stitched between layers of paper, sold in rolls as house insulation. She did not see the product. She heard about it from a station man who had read a catalog. The description sounded familiar: heat insulating, sound deadening, fire resisting, in the language of commerce rather than the language of practice. She said nothing about it. The commercial product was a parallel development, a company in a city finding a market for what coastal women had known for generations. Beret did not feel pride or anger. She felt the distance between a catalog and a corridor, between a product sold in rolls and a wall packed by hand with air inside it, and the distance was the difference between knowledge bought and knowledge earned. Rana's needle sat in a drawer in the kitchen. Beret took it out sometimes and held it. The ash wood was dark and smooth. The eye was wide enough for twine, but too narrow for rope. It was a tool designed for a single purpose by a woman who understood that purpose completely, and it had crossed an ocean and outlived its maker, and still fit the hand as if the hand had been made for it. The years compress the way years do when the work is steady and the crises are smaller. Tomas survived childhood. His chest never fully cleared. He breathed with effort on cold mornings for the rest of his life. But he grew tall and strong enough to work wood, and by 16 he was apprenticed to a boat builder in Wellfleet who valued his patience and his hands. He designed storm doors with double-sealed frames and ventilated cavities, and he never built a door without an inspection hatch because his mother had taught him that a wall you could not see inside was a wall you could not trust. Eli became a school teacher. She taught in the Truro Schoolhouse from 1898 until the building was consolidated with the Provincetown School in 1912. She kept a piece of dried eelgrass in her desk, a single ribbon, pale and curled, that she used to explain insulation to children who had never thought about why their houses were warm. She told them about air. She told them about pockets. She told them that the most important part of a wall was the part you could not see. Tolliff and Beret repaired storm porches for widows and fishermen and station houses along the Cape for 20 years. Tolliff's panels became the standard, cow, clean joints, removable inspection boards, 12-inch cavities packed by women who had learned from Beret or from women who had learned from Beret. The designs were never written down. They were carried in hands and passed through demonstration, the way the lesser tradition had been carried, the way Ragna had carried it across the Atlantic in her body and her memory. Beret grew old in the cabin Pater had left unfinished. The corridor was rebuilt twice. Once after the 1896 gale tore the outer door off its hinges, and once in 1903 when Tolliff replaced the entire frame with cedar that would outlast both of them. Each time the eelgrass was unpacked, inspected, and repacked, the material that was still good going back in, the material that had darkened or gone sour replaced with fresh stock from the autumn gathering. The cabin was never cold again, not because the corridor was magic, not because eelgrass violated the laws of heat and cold, because a woman who understood wind and air and the difference between a dead pocket and a moving current had placed 12 inches of trapped stillness between her family and the sea, and she had maintained it with the discipline of someone who knew that survival was not a single act, but a daily practice. In the last years, after Tolliff died of a stroke in 1917 and the children had long since built their own lives, Beret sat in the corridor during storms. Not because the cabin was cold, it was warm, always warm, but because the corridor was where she felt closest to the work. The passage still smelled of salt when the rain came. The inspection board still slid on Tolliff's grooves. The eelgrass behind them still sprang back when pressed, dry at the center, pale, patient, doing nothing except holding still. She touched the inspection board the way Ragna had touched the wall of the shed, cold on one side, still on the other. Between them, the packed quiet of a material that asked for nothing and gave everything. Beret Brecka Halverson died in the early winter of 1923 in the cabin on the outer cape. The corridor stood beside her door. The eelgrass was dry. By the time Beret was gone, more than 24 households along that stretch of coast had some version of an eelgrass-packed entry, wall bay, or storm vestibule built from what the tide left behind. Not everyone was elegant, some were crooked. Some smelled of salt during rain. But everyone had an inspection board that could be pulled free, a cavity that could be checked by hand, and a sill raised on stones above the wet ground. They were built by the people who lived inside them from material that cost nothing, using knowledge passed from one pair of hands to the next. Beret lived out her years in the same cabin Pater had left half finished on the dunes near Truro. The corridor was rebuilt twice, each time better. The needle Ragna carved sat in the kitchen drawer until Eli took it after the funeral and placed it in her own desk beside the ribbon of dried eelgrass. It is not recorded what happened to the needle after that. Some things survive only as long as the hands that hold them. On the morning of March 12th, 1888, the nor'easter had passed and the outer cape lay buried in sand-crusted snow. Hiram Pike lay on the floor of a corridor he had called a stinking ocean hallway, alive because the walls held and the air stayed still. Tomas breathed steadily beyond the cabin door, his fever broken, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of a boy who would survive to build storm doors of his own. Captain Alden Cobb stood at the inner threshold and held a latch that carried no frost in a cabin where the stove had burned half the wood he had predicted, and said nothing because the evidence was in his hand. Outside, the eelgrass packed behind the rough pine planks was dry at the center, pale, still springing back after the worst storm in a generation. Gray ribbons of dead seagrass washed ashore and left for the gulls, gathered by a woman who knew what it was because another woman had pressed her hand against a wall and said the trick was not heat, but stopping moving air. The sea had thrown it away. Beret Brecka Halverson built a wall from it,